Hey everyone, and welcome to another GameXplain discussion. I'm your host, Derek Bittner, and I'm joined today by Ash Paulson so he can give his thoughts on Radiant Historia Perfect Chronology for the Nintendo 3DS. So, Ash, what'd you end up thinking of the game?
Well, I'm still actually playing it. It's as those RPG fans know, it's a pretty lengthy RPG, and I actually played the original, but had to set it aside because I just got sidetracked with other things. But I'm glad I'm remedying that by playing the remake now, because it really is a phenomenal RPG. And if you have any love at all for the 16-bit glory days of Japanese RPGs, Radiant Historia should be on your radar. Like, if you haven't already played it, you should play it now with the remake.
I picked up the original DS version because I knew it was going to be one of those cult games just off the bat. So I was actually kind of surprised to see it get this remake treatment. And, I mean, you've played the original. How much does this new game update?
So that's what's funny about it, is that this is an easy recommendation for anyone who hasn't played the game before. It's a fantastic RPG, but as a remake, it's a little harder to recommend. Like, I feel like if you've already played Radiant Historia before, it's a little harder to recommend, because I feel like a lot of the new stuff they added ends up being kind of inconsequential, and at least in one case, actually, it's a negative. I feel like one of the aspects is actually worse than the original, but then there are a couple of things that are added that I feel add to it. So in terms of the remake stuff specifically, gets a little murky, but for first-time players, Perfect Chronology is like an easy recommendation for anyone who likes RPGs.
Well, let's go over those changes. You said there were some positives, some negatives in there. Let's do a compliment sandwich, I suppose, and start off with the good thing.
So the good thing right off the bat is they've added full voice acting to basically every cutscene, and there are a lot of cutscenes, so this is a ton of dialogue. But at the same time, this is Atlas, and Atlas is known for doing pretty great dubs. And I guess however you feel about their dubs in the past, you may not like them, but I have found the English dub for Perfect Chronology to be really fantastic, and it really adds a lot of emotional punch to the story. And the story is already really good. Like, that's already one of the best aspects of this game. And so it's really taking a story that already had a lot of emotional punch and a lot of drama, and just really giving it more with the addition of full voice acting in all major cutscenes.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there an option to have Japanese voice acting, or is it just English?
I think it's just English on the card, or when you download, but I believe they might be offering the Japanese voice track as DLC. I don't remember offhand, but I believe that might be a DLC option.
Okay. So, criticisms. What's the problem you have with this game?
It's more what they didn't update, and I'm kind of surprised by the graphics. The graphics are a little crisper, and the sprites look a little better, and it just looks a little better on the whole, but it kind of otherwise still looks like a DS game. And when you're talking about a 3DS game in 2018, it's kind of disappointing. There's no 3D. The assets don't really look all that updated, so it's not really a looker. I mean, the sprite animation's nice and definitely recalls those great 16-bit sprite animations from, JRPGs past, but the game on the whole really isn't a looker. So if you're looking for some eye candy to go along, with the RPG you're playing, this isn't it. Some of the other things they've added, so I think before I go into the next edition, I kind of have to explain how this game is structured.
Yeah, actually, I was just thinking of that as we were talking about this. For those of you who have not played this game at all, and you obviously recommended it, but for those who might be interested but don't know a lot about the game, what's the general outline of the story, and what kind of RPG mechanics are we looking at here as far as battle system and whatnot?
So it's become a very popular thing to say that it's just an easy comparison to Chrono Trigger, because Radiant Historia at its core is a story about time travel. Time travel is woven all throughout the story. It's a huge gameplay mechanic, so the obvious comparison is Chrono Trigger. However, I don't think it's exactly a direct comparison, because the way Radiant Historia handles time travel is completely different from Chrono Trigger. And what I mean by that is that there are two parallel timelines that you jump back and forth between throughout the game. And I guess to explain that, I'll kind of give you the Cliff's Notes version of the story. But basically, the whole thing takes place on the continent of Vancouver, which is, for some reason, succumbing to this desertification. So all the arable land is turning into desert, which has caused the nations of Alistel and Granor to fight over what little arable land remains. And you take the role of an Alistelian special intelligence operative named Stock, who is basically charged with getting a spy back behind enemy lines and getting their intel to his superiors. And things very quickly take a bad turn. His operation does not go as planned. He and his subordinates are basically killed. This isn't a spoiler because it's at the very beginning of the game, so don't worry. Things go south really quickly. But then he miraculously ends up in a place called Historia and finds out that he has the power to use a book called the White Chronicle to effect changes in time. So he can go back to this mission that went awry and make different decisions at key points to make things turn out in a better way. And so that's kind of what gets things going, and he uses the White Chronicle to go back to, during his mission, to set things right and guide history down a better path, and then things kind of go on from there. It's a really unique setup. I think what I like about it is that, again, I was kind of touching on the whole parallel timeline thing, and yeah, so you'll be playing the game, and you'll eventually get to a point where you cannot proceed any further. And the answer, usually, at that point, lies in the other timeline. So you're doing a lot of jumping between timelines to further the story in both. And it's a really interesting way of doing things, and it's fascinating, in my opinion.
And how's the combat?
So the combat is turn-based. It's a really interesting system. It's pretty snappy and quick. What's interesting is it's based around this grid system, where it's a 3x3 grid, and enemies can occupy any one of those 9 squares. And your characters have abilities that can move enemies from tile to tile. So you just have regular damaging attacks, but you also have certain attacks such as left assault or right assault. They can smack enemies to the left or right or to the back or pull them toward the front. And the key there is that you can actually smack enemies into the same space, and then any damage you do after that is going to hit all the enemies in that space. So a lot of it is about setting up combos and having one character knock enemies into the same square and then follow up with another character with a damaging attack that hits them all at once, and then maybe have another character smack that group of enemies to the very back with another one, and then have another, your next character hit all of them at the same time. So there are some really cool combos and chain attacks you can, if you're willing to strategize, you can really come up with some creative ways to take out an entire enemy party at once. And it's kind of required, to be honest. This isn't the kind of game where you can just spam attack and get through all the random battles. The game does expect you to learn the ins and outs of kind of comboing attacks together like this and playing with the spacing. So you are definitely expected to learn the game's rules and not just mindlessly mash through random battles. And which aren't random, by the way. You actually, in Chrono Trigger style, you run into enemies to initiate combat. Or they run into you, but you can avoid them if you like.
Has the remake changed anything about the battle system, or is it still pretty much the same as you remember?
It's pretty much the same. There is one other mechanic I haven't gone over yet, which is kind of key to it, and that is you are given the ability to have your characters switch turns with one another, or even enemies, at any time, with almost no restrictions. So on the bottom screen, you have the entire list of upcoming turns, both your characters and the enemy turns. And at any time, you can swap out those turns and change the turn order. The reason you'd want to do that is, say, 2 enemies have turns that break up your character's attacks. You can let them go first, and then you have a whole slot of your character's turns where you can build a combo and get things going. And really, the only penalty kind of levied on you for switching turns is that the character who switched is more vulnerable to damage for that turn. So you have to kind of consider, okay, well, if I have a character who has weak defense, if she switches, then she's going to be even more vulnerable for the next turn. But it could give you a tactical advantage to switch up the order in which turns are coming. So in that way, it's almost a little bit like Grandia, in that you can kind of see the turns coming, but you can do things to affect the order of those turns, and it's in fact encouraged and required for you to kind of game the system in that way. It's a really cool take on turn-based combat. It's something that I haven't really seen in a lot of other games, and it definitely is kind of its own unique take on what is otherwise a pretty tried-and-true system.
Absolutely. So what other changes have been put into the game beyond voice acting, beyond everything else you've described so far?
Well, going back to the 2 timeline thing, an early example of how this game expects you to think about things and progress is that, this is early in the game, so it's not a big spoiler, but you are in a mine and you're waiting for a messenger to arrive with explosives to clear the way forward. Well, that messenger never arrives, and you find out eventually that it's because in the other timeline, he was killed. And the timelines directly affect one another. So then you are literally blocked from proceeding with the story in one timeline, so you jump over to the other, find out what's causing the problem, like who's trying to kill this guy in the other timeline, how can you fix it, and once you do, you go back to the other timeline, and hey, the messenger arrives, and you can continue on with the story. And it's full of cool little time travel problems like that, and I think what I love is that time travel in this game isn't just a story element. It's literally a gameplay mechanic that's woven really deeply into the game experience. And I haven't seen another game handle time travel like that, and it's done so eloquently. But To go back to your question about more additions for the remake, there is now a third timeline. The first two timelines are called regular history and alternate history. And then this third new timeline they've added for the remake is called Possible Histories, I guess. And Atlas really put a lot of marketing, bombastic marketing behind this. Like, oh yeah, experience a whole new third timeline and completely changes everything. It really doesn't. The third timeline is fine, it's cool, but it really ultimately ends up being a series of very short vignettes that are basically windows into possible worlds, and they kind of have fun mixing up the characters' roles in ways you wouldn't expect. So it's fun for returning fans to see characters occupying roles in these possible histories that they otherwise don't in the main story. But at the same time, it all ends up feeling a little bit inconsequential, so I would hesitate to recommend Perfect Chronology to returning players on the basis of the third timeline alone. It's not that big a deal, and it's not as big a deal as Atlas wants you to think it is. And there's also a new dungeon called the Vault of Time, which is basically just an enemy dungeon where you can go, fight higher level enemies as you ascend further into the dungeon and get some nice rare equipment. So, that's fine, but in and of itself, I don't think it's a reason to pick up the remake if you've already feel like you've had your fill of the original game. But if you're a newcomer, this is all additional content, and it's great.
As I know you're a music lover, has the music been changed at all, or has they kept it pretty much the same?
I mean, the music has been remastered and I think enhanced a little bit, but the soundtrack itself is the same. And I think there are like 5 new tracks to accommodate some of the new content. Either way, it doesn't really matter. It's hard to tell, honestly. I feel like it's been enhanced and rearranged slightly, but not very much. But either way, the soundtrack is phenomenal anyway. It was great in the original. It's great now. It's Yoko Shimomura. She's one of the very best, in my opinion. Kingdom Hearts, Parasite Eve, all that good stuff. You totally hear her signature style here in this game. And if you're a Yoko Shimomura fan, you're going to love this soundtrack. I do sometimes find myself wishing there was a little more variety in the soundtrack. Like, I did notice that a lot of early game areas, and even some areas later in the game, share kind of like one same song, which I feel like could have been improved. I think there could be a little more diversity there. But in terms of the content that's there, the music is just fantastic.
Is there any other changes, updates, differences, things you liked, didn't like that you wanted to talk about with Radiant Historia?
Yeah, so unfortunately there's also this, there's basically been an entire art style change. And this is something that really caused a lot of negative attention around the game prior to release, and straight up, the new art style is worse. I mean, they've taken what was originally a very unique, like, sadness-tinged art style in the original game. It's just kind of like, it had an anime look, but it was a little more pallid than that, and just kind of had a slightly darker tinge to it. And they replaced that with basically a standard rent-an-anime look. And I love anime. Anime's great, but it's taking some of that uniqueness of the original art style and really just kind of streamlining it into a standard anime style, which we've seen in so many other games, and I kind of wish they hadn't taken that unique visual identity away from the game. Some characters are hit worse than others, like Stock, the main character, fortunately escapes mostly unscathed. He still looks pretty good, but then there are other characters like Erica, for fans of the game, who just they've had their designs completely changed, and it's 150% for the worse. And it's like, what were you thinking? Why would you do that? And to add insult to injury, Atlas is offering the original art style, like the original character portraits and stuff, as paid DLC. Oh. And that feels so wrong to me.
Yeah.
I hate that. Yeah.
Honestly, sounds like the situation between Aria of Sorrow and Dawn of Sorrow, because I remember feeling the same way, like playing Aria, having this gorgeous art style, and then you get to Dawn, and it's like, what's the Saturday morning cartoon crap?
Yeah, and I mean, it's nice anime art. It's not low rent or anything, but it's just standard, and it's just something that you see in a lot of other RPGs and just in a lot of anime, and it just kind of robs the game of what used to be a very unique visual identity.
I can see what you mean for returning players not getting as much out of this as new players, because the great thing is for new players and those who wanted to experience the game originally and having it be just a rare run, now you have a second shot. Now you can get the game again and see what you missed out on the first time. A little different, little remix, but still good overall.
Right, and what's also nice is that there are a couple of different ways you can choose to play the game. There's like I think it's called the Append mode and the Perfect mode, and both of those modes kind of switch up how the new content is presented. So if you prefer to go in and play the game the way it was originally done on the original DS, without the new story content. It'll still of course, be the new updated graphics and music and assets and everything, but it'll be the game that was originally released on DS in terms of the story content, and then it'll only give you the new stuff once you've beaten the game. So you can have that pure experience if you want it. Or you can do what I did and just go right into the perfect mode, which kind of weaves in the new content throughout the story as opposed to separating the two. So I do like that there's an option there, and there are also multiple different difficulties, which is one of my favorite things in an RPG, that you can, unfortunately you can't toggle between them multiple times during the game, but if you do find that it's too hard, you can knock the difficulty down. And if you're one of those people who doesn't care for RPG gameplay and just wants to follow along with a really cool story, the easy difficulty actually lets you attack enemies like normally it's you can attack enemies to get like a preemptive strike against them when you go into battle. In this easy mode, you can attack enemies in fields, and they'll actually be killed, and you still get the experience and gold from it. Without ever actually having to go into battle. The boss battles are still there, but that kind of helps you prepare for the boss battles if you don't want to bother with it. So, not what I would do personally, but I appreciate that Atlus gave us that option for players who really just may not want the hassle or the stress of what can be a pretty difficult game sometimes. Like, this isn't the easiest game to... I mean, you can grind, but the way the battle system is set up to be so heavily reliant on your ability to use the spacing correctly, it's not really the kind of game that you can just level up and steamroll through. So it is nice for those who don't want that difficulty aspect to just be able to play a story-focused version of it.
Well, any other thoughts on Radiant Historia, Perfect Chronology?
I would say and this is kind of an issue that the original game had, if you do play it, just be prepared for a little backtracking that can get slightly annoying, because basically the way time travel works is you can travel to key moments on both timelines. And the game does a pretty good job of giving you a lot of key moments to choose between to make it as convenient as possible not to have to do too much backtracking, but there are those times it'll come up where you need to get back to a specific part of the story of one timeline that you've already played, and it's not really spaced near any node that you can time travel to, so you just kind of have to travel to the nearest node and then just kind of replay up to where you need to go to change something or do something different. So that can be a little repetitive, it can feel a little backtracky, but at the same time, the game lets you skip any and all cutscenes that you've already watched. I think you can skip them the first time through too, so those return trips to previous story beats can be a lot faster.
Well, I know you haven't beaten the game yet. I don't know how much progress you made into it or not, but just based on what you've played so far, what are your feelings on it, I guess?
Well, I'm about 30 to 35 hours in, which, as I understand it, is about halfway or a little more than halfway. It's a pretty long game, I have to say. It's a pretty meaty experience, so it'll last you a long time. But this is an easy recommendation for me to anyone who has not played the game before and has a soft spot for those 16-bit glory days with JRPGs. This 100% is that kind of game, and it really does recall the kind of aesthetics and the kind of storytelling that you loved from those 16-bit RPGs. It really is a great game, and I personally, for people who have not played Radiant Historia ever, period, of course I haven't finished it as you said, but so far it's a pretty easy love it for me. It's a really, really good JRPG, and unless the story just takes a complete nosedive in the second half, which I don't think is going to happen because the story is so good and the cast of characters is so good, it's an easy love it for me. On the other hand, if you feel like you've had your fill and are only coming back for the new content, it's maybe kind of a kind of a shaky like it, because the game is still great, but I don't know if it's worth a full price purchase just for the new content for the reasons that I've gone over.
Alright, I think that covers it for our Radiant Historia review discussion, so thank you for watching, and if you liked this video, be sure to like us on Facebook and Twitter at GameXplain, and of course make sure to subscribe to GameXplain for more on the Switch and other things gaming as well. Until next time, bye.